Good evening, traveller. Welcome to Lanterns of Time, a quiet place where the past unfolds slowly, like a lantern warming into life. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to settle. Let the noise of the day loosen its grip, let the air around you soften, and let your breath fall into its own gentle rhythm. And if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a small wonder to see these stories drifting across different corners of the world. And if this kind of quiet storytelling feels like home to you, feel free to subscribe, only if you truly enjoy being here. Tonight, we walk into a part of history shaped not by battles or crowns, but by boundaries, the rules and restrictions that once guided how entire civilizations lived. These rules touched everything: the garments people wore, the food they prepared, the words they spoke, and the places they were allowed to stand. Across thousands of years, societies were shaped, guided, and sometimes quietly tightened by rules, whispered by priests, carved in stone, announced by kings, or passed down as gentle warnings from one household to the next. Some were created to protect, some to control, and some simply grew out of fears we no longer carry. Most have faded now, dissolving like candle smoke in a high ceiling. But once, they shaped every corner of daily life, deciding who could wear color, who could walk where, who could speak aloud, and who had to remain invisible. Tonight, we trace those forgotten boundaries, not to judge them, but to understand the worlds that once lived within them, and the slow human unraveling that eventually set us free. Whenever you're ready, traveller, we open the lantern and step into the first of these ancient restrictions, the strange, quiet laws woven into the clothes people wore. Clothing has always been one of the quietest storytellers in human history. Long before people announced their titles, spoke their names, or shared their thoughts, their garments spoke for them. Softly, firmly, and sometimes more truthfully than they wished. Fabric became biography. Color became declaration, and in many eras the rules surrounding what one could or could not wear shaped the boundaries of life more closely than any written law. To step into this world, imagine the soft, pearly light of an early Roman morning. The city is just stirring, merchants lifting wooden shutters, bakers dusting flour from their hands, children trailing behind parents as they carry water from the fountains. Every figure wears clothing so simple that it might seem unremarkable at first glance. Wool wrapped around shoulders, belts tied with quiet practicality, sandals dusty from the previous day's walk. But look closer and you'll see that even these plain garments contain a code. For in Rome, color was not merely decoration, it was power. Among all hues, one shade commanded special attention: a rich, ocean-deep purple, bright as dusk and precious as gold. Achieved by extracting dye from thousands of murex sea snails harvested along distant shores, this purple shimmered with a luster that never fully dulled. It was a color that caught flame in sunlight and whispered authority even in the shade, and so Rome guarded it fiercely. Only emperors were permitted to wear it freely. Senators could wear a narrow stripe, no wider than 2 fingers. Everyone else, regardless of wealth, talent, or ambition, was forbidden. A prosperous merchant could buy 100 bolts of wool, a chest of spices, even a small ship, but he would never dare to own a robe dyed entirely in purple. Not because he disliked the color, but because wearing it could be interpreted as an act of treason. The cloth itself was harmless. The meaning it carried was not a single thread could elevate or destroy someone's life. These were not laws of vanity, they were laws of order, a system built to keep the social world visually stable, instantly legible. One glance across a forum could tell you who held power, who served it, and who existed beneath it. This same idea traveled across continents and centuries, resurfacing in medieval Europe with its own unmistakable edge. There, rulers introduced sumptuary laws, detailed regulations on who could wear what, down to the exact richness of a cloak's fabric or the width of a fur trim. Velvet might belong only to nobility, fine lace only to the upper classes, gold embroidery exclusively to the elite. A wealthy merchant's daughter might long for a dress of shimmering silk after seeing it in a marketplace. Her family could afford it. Her mother might even encourage it, but the law would not permit it. Silk belonged to the noble class alone. A tailor caught selling such a garment to the wrong customer could face fines, and the buyer would be reprimanded for trying to blur the line between worlds. Still, ordinary people remained creative. They added beauty in ways that didn't violate the rules. A carefully chosen color, a clever pattern woven from cheaper materials, or small beads sewn into hems where inspectors rarely looked. These were the quiet rebellions of the era, soft, almost secretive expressions of identity tucked under the watchful eye of authority. Far across the sea in Edo period Japan, the same logic existed, but with an elegant, unique twist. The streets of Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka were alive with color. Lantern sellers, performers, merchants shouting prices, children weaving between crowds. Yet the shogunate saw such vibrancy as a threat to order and encouraged visual modesty among the common class bright. Elaborate robes were restricted to the upper castes or those who served at the highest levels of society. Merchants, many of whom had become extraordinarily wealthy, were expected to appear humble. Outwardly, their robes remained subdued in color, indigo, charcoal, muted brown. But inside those garments, on the linings meant only for private moments, a secret world blossomed. There were silks embroidered with cranes soaring above waves, patterns of swirling gold hidden beneath simple outer layers, bold reds tucked in seams that only revealed themselves in motion. These linings became private canvases, a quiet reminder that though appearance could be controlled, taste could not. Even more unusual rules appeared across Renaissance Europe. In Florence, laws restricted the size of pearl jewelry according to a woman's social class. In England, only royalty might wear certain types of ermine. In Spain, particular lacework patterns were reserved exclusively for noble families elsewhere. Men were forbidden to wear shoes with extravagantly long pointed toes unless they held land. A curious attempt to prevent lower classes from indulging in fashionable absurdities. Some rules aimed to maintain public morality. Others tried to preserve religious purity. Still others simply reinforced the boundaries of class. But no matter their purpose, these laws shaped how people saw themselves and one another. Imagine walking through a medieval street, stones uneven underfoot, smoke drifting from hearths, a distant church bell carrying through the air. You could tell people's roles almost instantly by looking at their clothing. It wasn't judgment. It was simply how society worked. A noblewoman in velvet moved differently than a baker's wife in linen. A scribe's ink stains marked him as clearly as a soldier's cloak. The world communicated through cloth. Yet as time passed, these rules became increasingly difficult to enforce. Trade expanded, creating access to dyes and fabrics once rare. Middle classes grew wealthier. Fashion changed faster than laws could be rewritten. Eventually, what people desired to wear exceeded what the old restrictions allowed. Some rebellions were small, a secret trim sewn inside a garment, others bolder, a merchant commissioning a robe too fine for his station, wearing it proudly at home even if he hid it in public. Slowly, the threadbare boundaries of old rules began to fray. Soon, lawmakers found themselves chasing shifting tastes and growing markets, unable to maintain the clarity of the old visual hierarchy. And so the world moved on. Silk stopped being dangerous. Purple lost its exclusivity. Bright kimono linings stepped out into the open. Fashion democratized, becoming less a badge of rank and more a form of self-expression. The rules softened, the meanings faded. And for the first time in history, people began to choose clothing, not because they were commanded to, but because they felt something when they touched the fabric. Pride, joy, beauty, identity. And in that quiet shift, the story of forbidden clothing came to its gentle end. Food is one of the oldest languages humanity has ever spoken. Before people carved stories into stone, before they built temples or traded across seas, they gathered around fires to eat. It was through food that families bonded, tribes defined themselves, and communities expressed belief. And just as certain dishes were treasured, others were surrounded by invisible fences, boundaries shaped by faith, superstition, medical theory, fear, or authority. To understand these ancient prohibitions, imagine a small village in the early morning. The fire is newly lit, and a pot of grain bubbles quietly in the center of a clay hearth. A mother adds herbs handed down through generations. A child stirs the pot carefully, learning which ingredients belong in the family's diet and which should never be touched. The rules are not written nor explained in full. They are simply known, woven into the rhythm of life as natural as breath. Across the ancient Near East, dietary laws were not casual suggestions. They were part of the architecture of faith. Among the Israelites, the concept of clean and unclean animals defined everything from marketplaces to festivals. Pork, though widely eaten in other Mediterranean societies, became a marker of separation. To refrain from it was to draw a line of belonging, a cultural and spiritual boundary that strengthened identity in lands where influence shifted often. These prohibitions did more than dictate meals. They shaped the emotional world of families. They guided hospitality, festivals, and even the way people interpreted illness. To follow such rules was to honor ancestors, to respect a covenant, to maintain a sense of order in a vast and uncertain world. Centuries later, Islamic dietary laws carried forward similar ideas, though shaped by different beliefs. Cleanliness, intention, and compassion guided the preparation of food. Markets came alive with butchers trained to follow strict guidelines, and families passed down recipes designed to align with the Quran's teachings. Children grew up knowing why certain meats were avoided, why utensils used for forbidden foods were kept separate, and why meals were shared generously during festive seasons. Eating itself became a mindful act, one that connected people to their communities through shared discipline and rhythm. But not all prohibitions came from faith. Some grew from fear, misunderstanding, or the simple strangeness of a new ingredient. When the tomato first arrived in Europe in the 16th century, its glossy red skin made it look suspicious. Noble families brought it into their homes, decorating tables with its bright, almost theatrical appearance. Yet when guests fell ill afterward, victims of lead poisoning from their ornate pewter plates, the tomato was blamed. It was labeled dangerous, possibly satanic, a fruit too bold and too foreign to trust. For decades it was grown as a curiosity, admired from afar but never tasted. In gardens across Europe, the most iconic ingredient of future cuisines sat untouched by those who feared it most. The potato, now beloved around the world, walked a similar path through suspicion. It arrived in Europe with no long cultural story to anchor it. It grew underground, a trait that unsettled many. Its pale flesh looked unnatural. Its leaves reminded some of plants associated with poison, and its resilience made it seem almost too hardy. In some towns, people believed it caused illness simply because they saw the unfamiliar and assumed danger. Whole communities rejected a crop that could have eased famine, choosing caution over curiosity. Far to the east, in China's Imperial court, dietary bans reflected a world where food was inseparable from symbolism. Emperors consulted astrologers, physicians, and scholars before deciding which dishes were suitable for a given season. Certain foods were forbidden because their shapes resembled unlucky symbols. Some were banned temporarily because their colors clashed with annual rituals. Others interfered with medicinal regimens believed essential to maintaining internal harmony. A bowl of soup could be seen not as nourishment, but as a disruption to cosmic balance. Banned foods shifted with each reign, creating a culinary landscape shaped not only by taste, but by philosophy. Court kitchens navigated these restrictions with creativity, substituting ingredients, developing new techniques, and adjusting menus to honor both tradition and the emperor's health. What was forbidden in one decade might be embraced in the next, turning the dining hall into a reflection of the era's intellectual climate. In Japan, the influence of Buddhism once stretched so deeply into daily life that meat eating was discouraged or outlawed for centuries. Families adapted with grace and invention. They developed dishes crafted from tofu, root vegetables, seaweed, and fish, meals that balanced simplicity with elegance. Temples grew gardens dedicated to ingredients that aligned with spiritual values. Even after prohibitions softened, the habits persisted, becoming part of a culinary identity that endures today. A rule meant to restrict eventually became a root of cultural pride. Elsewhere, dietary bans grew stranger still. In some medieval European communities, eels were feared because people believed their slithering forms carried the souls of the restless dead. In parts of northern Europe, garlic was avoided not for its pungency, but because it was believed to attract malevolent spirits or spark troublesome gossip. Some towns discouraged the eating of certain cheeses during hot months, convinced they fermented strange thoughts or invited illness. And in the age of New World exploration, debates swept through European monasteries over whether drinking chocolate during fasting hours counted as breaking spiritual discipline. Entire councils gathered to decide whether the rich, dark beverage should be considered food or drink. And then there were bans driven not by fear or faith, but by hierarchy. In many feudal societies, the best cuts of meat were reserved for nobility, not because they tasted better, though they often did, but because they symbolized power. A farmer might raise sheep and cattle his whole life, yet be forbidden from tasting the finest portions of the animals he tended. Even the kitchen echoed with social structure. Certain spices were reserved for palaces, certain fish for festivals only, and certain dishes prepared exclusively for those who governed. But as trade expanded and as knowledge crossed borders, many of these ancient bans began to weaken. Tomatoes eventually found their place on plates potatoes fed entire nations. Foods once feared became cherished. The line between forbidden and accepted blurred, softened, and, in many cases, disappeared entirely. Yet the memory of those bans left traces. Certain rituals remain. Certain dishes still carry symbolic meaning. And in every culture, there are remnants of food rules born centuries ago, reminders that what we eat has never been only about hunger. Food bans, in their quiet way, reveal a deeper story, a story of what people believed, what they feared, what they valued, and how they tried to make sense of a world that often felt unpredictable. And as those beliefs shifted, so too did the tables they gathered around. Language is one of the most delicate forces in human history. A single word can comfort, divide, inspire, or destroy. It can carry identity, memory, or sorrow, and because words hold such power, many societies tried to control them. Entire phrases vanished from daily life. Names disappeared from public memory. Ordinary expressions became dangerous. And silence, in many eras, became a form of survival. To begin this journey, imagine a quiet evening in an ancient city. The sun has slipped behind rooftops, leaving a warm glow fading through the streets. Families gather at doorways, sharing the last conversations of the day. And woven into those soft exchanges is something you cannot hear: the missing pieces. Words people once used freely, now forbidden by rulers or by belief. One of the earliest examples comes from ancient Egypt, where names were believed to hold a person's essence. To erase a name from monuments or papyrus was not simply to edit a record, it was to strike at the soul itself. When political tides shifted, rulers who fell from favor sometimes had their names chipped from stone, their images scratched away, and their memory pressed into silence. Speaking their names aloud became risky, even disloyal. The pharaoh Akhenaten, remembered today for defying tradition, became one of those ghosts. After his death, officials set about erasing him. Temples he built were dismantled, statues recarved. His name avoided in both writing and speech. For decades, generations grew up without hearing him mentioned at all. To honor the restored order, people learned to speak around his existence as though he had never lived. A similar practice took root in ancient Rome. When the Senate condemned someone as an enemy of the state, they declared a condemnation of memory. Their statues were destroyed or altered, their inscriptions erased, and their names quietly removed from public discussion. Citizens spoke of them indirectly. The one who betrayed us, the man who is gone. Silence became a warning as sharp as any public punishment. Certain stories were not meant to survive. But forbidden speech did not always grow from politics. Sometimes it emerged from cultural change. During the French Revolution, traditional titles like Monsieur and Madame became symbols of inequality. Revolutionary leaders insisted on new uniform greetings, citizen and citizeness. Using an old form of address could invite suspicion or hostility. In cafes and marketplaces, people began to weigh their words carefully, catching themselves before a familiar greeting slipped out. In turbulent times, vocabulary itself became a battleground. Victorian England, by contrast, practiced a softer kind of censorship. The era's obsession with propriety transformed perfectly ordinary words into social hazards. The word leg, for instance, was considered too intimate for polite company. It was replaced with gentler terms like limb or avoided altogether. Even the legs of furniture were sometimes covered with small cloth skirts, as if the household feared that wooden curves might cause embarrassment. Victorians navigated conversation like a narrow bridge. Anything referring directly to the human body, illness, or physicality was softened into euphemism. A cough became a slight indisposition. Underwear was referred to as unmentionables. People danced verbally around simple truths because speaking too plainly violated an unspoken contract of decorum. In East Asia, the suppression of words took a different shape. In Imperial China, it was customary to avoid speaking names of emperors or certain revered figures. Because pronouncing an emperor's name directly was seen as disrespectful, people changed words that sounded similar or rewrote texts entirely to avoid unintended offense. Scholars sometimes revised entire poems to ensure they did not echo a forbidden syllable. A single word could be the boundary between respect and danger. Similarly, in Japan during certain historical periods, the names of the recently deceased, especially within noble families, were temporarily avoided to allow spirits to pass in peace. Alternative names or descriptive titles were used instead. Speech became a ritual act of reverence, shaping mourning through silence. Elsewhere in the world, forbidden language grew from spiritual belief. In some northern European villages, certain animals or mythical beings were never named aloud at night. People believed that calling them directly might summon their presence. Bringing misfortune or stirring storms, hunters used coded nicknames: the Brown One, the Silent Walker, the One in the Pines. Children learned early that some names carried more weight than others, especially after dusk. In many indigenous cultures worldwide, the names of the recently departed were avoided for months or years. Not as punishment, but out of deep respect, allowing the spirit to move freely without being held back by the sound of its earthly name. Families created gentle alternatives, forming a language shaped by love and loss. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, heretical ideas were not only banned, the very vocabulary surrounding them was scrubbed from public speech. Words associated with forbidden teachings quietly disappeared from sermons, manuscripts, and conversation. People learned to avoid certain phrases, not because they understood the theology behind them, but because danger echoed in the silence. And in more modern times, authoritarian governments refined this control. Throughout the 20th century, regimes across the world outlawed specific words, redefined others, and replaced many with official slogans. Speaking truthfully about certain events, using prescribed terms, or even telling a joke could bring punishment. Banned words became symbols of resistance, whispered carefully or replaced with metaphors. Those who wished to dissent learned to speak in riddles, letting implication do what direct statements could not. Yet even under the strictest censorship, language found ways to bend rather than break. People invented coded expressions. Shared glances replaced risky phrases. Songs smuggled truth in metaphors. Jokes carried meanings that could not be written down. Silence, once imposed, became a space where resistance quietly grew. As centuries passed and power shifted, many forbidden words returned to the world. Names once erased were rediscovered. Expressions once whispered resurfaced. Entire languages rebuilt themselves after periods of forced quiet. Still, the memory of those silences remains. It reminds us that words are never mere sound. They are identity, history, defiance, tenderness, fear, hope. When words disappear, it is rarely accidental, and when they return, they carry with them the weight of all the silence that came before. Human movement has always been a quiet language. A bowed head, a straightened spine, a lifted hand. These gestures communicate respect, defiance, belonging, or fear far more quickly than words. And across history, countless societies sought to control that language. They created rules not only for what people could wear or say, but for how they could stand, walk, kneel, or even breathe in the presence of power. Imagine a stone courtyard in ancient times, warmed by the fading light of late afternoon. A group of people gathers before a palace gate. Their movements shift and settle in unison. Backs straighten, hands clasp behind or before the body, steps shorten and voices drop. No one gives direct instructions. The rules are simply understood, rules about posture, distance, and the choreography of respect. In Imperial China, court etiquette was so intricate that visitors sometimes spent years learning how to move correctly in the emperor's presence. Kneeling was not a simple act of lowering oneself. It was a sequence with precise angles and rhythms. A single misstep, rising too soon, bowing too shallowly, touching the floor incorrectly, could be interpreted as disrespect. Court officials practiced the 3 bows and 9 prostrations, a ritual that demanded not only strength but absolute control. The gesture expressed submission and loyalty, but it also reinforced a deep social boundary. The emperor stood beyond reach. But China was not alone in this. In the courts of medieval Europe, subjects were expected to approach royalty in carefully regulated patterns. One must not turn their back on a king or queen stepping too close, lifting one's head too quickly, or even sitting uninvited could be seen as an affront. In certain royal courts, chairs were symbols of rank. Everyone knew who was permitted to sit, who must stand, and who must kneel on cold stone floors. Visitors who forgot these rules learned quickly, often through scolding, sometimes through punishment. In Japan, the samurai class developed elaborate systems of etiquette known collectively as forms of correct behavior. These guided how one should enter a room, how deeply to bow, and how to fold the legs when seated. Even the direction a person faced carried meaning. To turn one's back on a superior was forbidden. To walk in front of them without permission was unthinkable. The body itself became a sign of loyalty or of rebellion. Elsewhere, religious practices shaped forbidden gestures. In some Middle Eastern societies of antiquity, raising one's hand in certain public spaces was restricted because it could be misinterpreted as a sign of curse or challenge. Gestures that today seem harmless once carried immense weight because they echoed spiritual or political symbols. A palm turned outward might mean blessing. The same palm turned slightly downward could imply condemnation. Ordinary people learned to keep their hands still to avoid misunderstandings. In medieval Christian Europe, church rituals controlled bodily movement with remarkable precision. Kneeling, standing, crossing oneself, bowing, each action had a proper time and place, and performing them incorrectly could draw attention or disapproval. Physical posture was tied to devotion. Even the way the faithful sat or stood during sermons reflected moral expectations. Restlessness was discouraged. Stillness was encouraged. Quiet behavior was a form of reverence. Some restrictions came from fear rather than reverence. In various regions of Eastern Europe, legends warned against whistling indoors at night. The sound, people believed, might summon misfortune or wandering spirits. In certain fishing towns, stepping over a rope or net was considered a grave insult to the sea and the spirits who protected those who worked upon it. Gestures that seemed trivial carried risks shaped by centuries of cultural memory. And across many indigenous cultures worldwide, pointing directly at someone was forbidden. It was seen as a gesture that could disrupt harmony or challenge a person's spiritual balance. Instead, people used subtle cues, a tilt of the head, a soft wave of the hand, to guide attention. Movement itself was treated with respect. In some societies, these rules grew stricter still. During the reigns of certain Middle Eastern empires, subjects approaching rulers were required to touch the ground with their foreheads or chests, to stand too tall, to look too boldly, or even to breathe too loudly in the ruler's presence could spark suspicion. Silence and lowered posture were safeguards that kept one's life intact. In early modern Europe, military discipline introduced new boundaries. Soldiers learned not only where to march, but how to march. The length of a stride, the timing of each footfall, the exact tilt of a musket. Infractions were not simply mistakes, they were signs of disorder. Precision became an instrument of power. Even within everyday life, forbidden movements shaped behavior. In Victorian society, sitting with one's legs crossed at the knee was considered improper for women, a sign of carelessness or impropriety. Instead, they were instructed to sit with ankles neatly aligned, hands folded in their lap. For men, certain gestures, such as removing one's jacket in public, were frowned upon as undignified etiquette manuals offered entire chapters on correct deportment, guiding everything from how to pour tea to how to descend a staircase. In medieval Islamic courts, guests learned to avoid stepping on the threshold of a doorway as it was considered disrespectful. One should step over it cleanly, showing honor to the household. Small details like these shaped the dance of hospitality. To move incorrectly was not only impolite, but a breach of trust. Movement also became a form of quiet rebellion. In societies where kneeling signified submission, standing upright could be a powerful act of resistance. In places where certain bows were mandated, refusing to bow at all took courage. Bodies communicated what words could not. A person could break a rule without speaking, simply by choosing a gesture outside the approved script. Yet over time, like all systems of control, these bodily restrictions began to soften. People changed their posture, they walked differently, they reclaimed gestures once forbidden, letting their movements reflect ease rather than fear. What had once been rigid became fluid. What had once been forbidden slowly returned to the natural rhythm of daily life. But the memory of those restrictions lingers. It reminds us that human movement, as simple as raising a hand, turning a head, or taking a step, has never been neutral. It has been shaped by power, belief, and tradition. Every gesture carries history, every posture carries meaning, and every movement, no matter how small, echoes centuries of rules, both spoken and unspoken. Night has always carried a different rhythm from the day. When the sun disappears, the world softens, shadows lengthen, and sounds stretch farther through the air. But in many eras, night also marked a threshold, a boundary where rules tightened and freedom shrank. Entire civilizations created strict limitations on what people could do after sunset, shaping evenings into a time of caution, ritual, and enforced quiet. To step into this world, imagine the final glow of dusk fading across the rooftops of ancient Rome. The city hums with its usual energy, vendors shouting final bargains, sandals scuffing stone streets, the scent of warm bread drifting from bakeries. But as the last traces of daylight slip away, torches are lit, shutters close, and laws older than memory take hold. In Rome, night was a moment of vulnerability. Crowded streets, uneven lighting, and the presence of thieves made the hours after dark a breeding ground for disorder. And so, gatherings were heavily restricted. Large groups were forbidden from meeting without permission. Especially in the poor districts where unrest simmered more easily, fires too posed a constant threat in a city built partly of wood. After sundown, households were expected to keep lamps small, watch flames closely, and move cautiously. One overturned candle could ignite an entire block. The fear of night was not superstition, it was survival. Further east in medieval England, the ringing of the curfew bell was a nightly ritual. As the sound echoed through villages and towns, it carried a clear command. Fires must be dampened, households must settle, and the streets must empty. The word curfew itself came from an old expression meaning cover the fire, a reminder that in an age without organized fire brigades, the smallest spark could consume a home in minutes after the bell. Being outside without purpose invited suspicion or arrest. Night was not for wandering, it was for stillness. In Japan's Edo period, citizens needed official wooden tablets, small identification boards, to be outside after dark. Without them, even a brief walk could result in detention. The streets belonged to appointed night watchmen who patrolled with lanterns and clappers, ensuring order. Inns recorded the names of every guest. Even the flow of travelers slowed. Arriving in a town too late meant sleeping by the gates until morning. Night was a time to be accounted for, not a time to roam freely. Across the Islamic world in antiquity, certain cities enforced nighttime silence in residential quarters. Loud voices, music, or gatherings were discouraged after twilight to preserve peace. In rural communities, it was believed that the night belonged not to humans, but to spirits wandering through the cool air. People moved quietly, if at all, respecting a boundary older than any written law. Some prohibitions took on spiritual meaning. In parts of northern Europe, whistling after dark was discouraged, believed to summon misfortune or unwanted visitors. People learned to avoid sharp, piercing sounds in the evening. Instead, conversations softened. Homes closed their doors tightly. The hush was not merely preference, it was protection. In medieval Jewish communities, lighting fires or performing certain forms of labor after sunset on specific days was strictly prohibited. These rules were expressions of devotion, shaping evenings into pockets of contemplation and rest. Night became a sacred pause, a time for reflection and quiet ritual. The street would dim, households would still, and the rhythm of the community would shift inward, guided not by fear, but by reverence. Other societies imposed nighttime restrictions to protect political stability. In certain African kingdoms, drums could not be played after dark without explicit approval from elders or chiefs. The sound of drums traveled far, echoing across plains and forests. In the wrong hands, they could signal rebellion. Silence, therefore, became a tool of governance. In ancient Athens, there were periods when carrying weapons at night was forbidden for all but magistrates. Darkness was seen as a cloak for impulsive acts, and the city sought to keep tempers controlled and streets safe. Night was a time when even men known for boldness walked more cautiously, aware that their gestures and footsteps carried a different weight. Medieval monasteries held some of the strictest nighttime rules of all. Monks retired early and silence became absolute. Even during night prayers, movement was hushed, speech limited to chants. To disturb the stillness was to break the spiritual order of the cloister. Within these stone walls, night was not a threat but a discipline, a space shaped by intention. And in indigenous communities across the world, teachings often warned young people not to wander after dark, not because of laws, but because of long-held beliefs. Night carried stories of ancestors, of spirits, of the natural world in its own rhythm. To respect that rhythm was to respect the land itself. Over time, as cities grew and lighting improved, many of these nighttime restrictions faded. Streets remained awake longer, taverns and theaters stayed open, curfews dissolved into memory. The night transformed from a period of restraint into a canvas for activity and expression. Yet echoes of old rules remain. Cities still ring bells, though now they signal hours, not commands. People still lower their voices as evening deepens. We still dim lights, draw curtains, and gravitate toward quiet spaces. And though the strict rules of ancient nights have loosened, the instinct to tread carefully in darkness survives in subtle ways. It lives in the way we speak softly under moonlight, the way we follow lit paths, the way we sense the world differently when shadows lengthen. Night has always held two truths, danger and wonder. And across history, the forbidden acts of nighttime reveal how humanity tried to navigate the thin line between both, shaping a world where silence could protect and darkness could teach. Color is one of the oldest hierarchies in human civilization, a quiet system of symbols worn on cloth, painted on walls, carried in banners, and guarded by those who believed that certain hues did not belong to everyone across empires and kingdoms. Color was controlled as tightly as currency or land. Some shades were associated with holiness, others with power, others with the weight of tradition, and many were kept beyond reach, forbidden to those of the wrong birth or the wrong station. Imagine a world without synthetic dyes, where every color comes from the earth itself. Ground minerals, crushed insects, rare plants gathered at dawn, or pigments pulled from deep beneath the sea. In such a world, color was not merely aesthetic. It was precious, costly, labor-intensive, and infused with meaning. And because meaning is power, rulers learned early to control which hues the people could wear. Begin again in ancient Rome, where color told a story long before words were spoken. Purple, the same deep tone that glowed in ceremonial robes, signified authority on a level unmatched by any other hue extracted from thousands of murex snails. The dye shimmered uniquely under sunlight and seemed to absorb depth in shadow. It became the emperor's color. A draped cloak dyed entirely in this shade announced sovereignty with a clarity no decree could match. Senators were allowed a narrow stripe of purple, but only narrow ordinary citizens were permitted none at all. Purple became a wall, a boundary woven into fabric. In the Byzantine Empire, this symbolism grew even stronger. Emperors were said to be born in the purple, a phrase referring both to their birth in a palace chamber lined with purple marble and to their exclusive right to the color only imperial garments could use the true deep shade. A merchant might wear a faint lavender, a soldier a duller tone, but the pure, commanding purple belonged to the throne alone. Any attempt to imitate it was not fashion, it was treason. Across medieval Europe, color restrictions varied by region but shared a common thread. Certain hues were seen as too magnificent to be worn freely. Scarlet, a bold red dye derived from insects, required immense resources to produce. It became a color for clergy, nobility, and high-ranking officials. Only those with recognized status could wear garments saturated with that brilliant, commanding red. A farmer wearing scarlet would seem out of place, even rebellious. The law, in many cases, made sure they never tried. Gold, too, was more than metal. It was a color of the divine. In some kingdoms, cloth of gold, fabric woven with real metal threads, was reserved for royalty or for sacred ceremonies. Religious leaders wore it during festivals. Kings wore it during coronations. Common people seldom touched it, let alone wore it. To be surrounded by gold was to sit in light elevated above the world. In East Asia, color also held profound significance. Yellow, the color of earth and center, symbolized stability and authority in imperial China. Dynasties reserved the brightest, richest shade for the emperor alone. His robes often glowed with golden yellow threads, embroidered with symbols of cosmic balance. Officials wore muted versions of the color only with permission. Commoners were barred from wearing it entirely. The ban was not only a matter of hierarchy, but of cosmology, as if to wear the emperor's color was to disturb the order of the world. Far to the west, in the kingdoms of Africa, color restrictions sometimes reflected spiritual importance. Among the Ashanti people, specific colors were associated with royal lineage, sacred rituals, or funerary rites. Certain shades of black and red were reserved for ceremonies honoring ancestors. Golden patterns woven into kente cloth held meanings tied to leadership or wisdom. To wear the wrong pattern at the wrong moment was to disrupt the harmony between the living and the spiritual world. In medieval Japan, strict rules determined which colors could be worn by various ranks within the court. Shades held symbolic meanings: purity, loyalty, authority, or mourning. The precise combination of hue and fabric served as a code, conveying someone's position without a single word. Brilliant colors belonged to those with high status, subdued tones were expected of others. Even seasonal colors were regulated. A shade appropriate in spring could be forbidden in winter. Rules shifted with time, like a palette controlled by tradition. In the Middle East, the color green carried sacred significance in Islamic culture, associated with paradise and the lineage of the Prophet. While not universally forbidden, certain shades or uses of green were reserved for specific religious contexts. This lent the color an aura of respect and sanctity, encouraging its use in worship and discouraging its use in trivial or disrespectful ways. Color, in many societies, marked who mourned and how they mourned. In some European regions, widows were expected to wear black for months or years, depending on custom. In others, particular shades of grey or muted blue were required. These rules were not merely fashion. They were public declarations of grief, codified by culture. To wear bright colors during mourning could be seen as offensive. Conversely, wearing mourning colors without a legitimate reason could invite suspicion. Sometimes the restrictions bordered on the strange. In medieval Florence, laws forbade women of certain classes from wearing particular shades of blue if they could not prove noble heritage. In Venice, specific reds were reserved for courtesans, while others were off-limits entirely. In Tudor England, only the royal family could use specific regal tones of crimson and gold. Even in the harsh climates of Scandinavia, where practicality shaped clothing more than luxury, color restrictions appeared in ritual contexts. Certain hues were reserved for weddings, funerals, or seasonal celebrations. Behind all these rules lay a common belief. Color was not neutral. It expressed identity, status, reverence, or defiance. To control color was to control the visual language of society itself. But colors, like ideas, refused to remain contained forever. Trade expanded. New dyes arrived from distant lands. Merchants grew wealthier and more adventurous. People learned to mix pigments creatively, subtly imitating forbidden shades. The border between allowed and forbidden began to blur. A noble's purple became a merchant's deep blue. A royal crimson softened into a common rose. A sacred yellow turned into honey gold worn at festivals. Centuries passed, and bit by bit, the old restrictions lost their force. The emperor's yellow became a color for festivals and celebrations. The nobleman's scarlet appeared in the garments of traders. Purple, once reserved for the rarest robes on earth, became accessible to anyone with curiosity and a desire for beauty. Today, colors are no longer locked behind laws. They are chosen freely, guided by taste, emotion, or memory rather than decree. Yet the history of forbidden colors lingers quietly, a reminder that the simplest things, a shade of cloth, a streak of dye, a glimmer of pigment, once carried enormous weight. What was once forbidden now fills wardrobes, murals, festivals, and streets. And in this bright, varied world, the old rules feel distant, like faint echoes from an age when color was power, and power was always watching. Throughout history, borders were not always lines drawn on maps. They were thresholds, walls, and invisible boundaries that shaped where people could walk, live, and even stand. Some places were forbidden to protect sacredness, others to defend power, others simply because fear clung to their shadows. To cross into these restricted spaces was to challenge authority, belief, or tradition itself. Imagine an ancient city at dawn. Vendors roll open wooden shutters. Women carry water jars past stone wells. Children chase each other along dusty paths, and weaving through these familiar scenes are areas no one dares to enter. A courtyard marked by symbols, a gate watched carefully by guards, an alley whispered to be cursed. These forbidden places are not empty, they are charged with meaning. Begin with ancient Rome, a city bustling with life but shaped by strict spatial rules. Some areas were considered sacred and off-limits except during special festivals. The Vestal Virgins, guardians of the eternal flame, had their own enclosed compound. No man was permitted to enter. The penalty was severe, not merely as a legal infraction, but as an act against the gods. To step inside without right was to violate something older than the empire itself. Other Roman boundaries centered on class. There were elite residential districts where only the wealthy could live, guarded not by walls but by social expectation. Slaves could enter only on duty. Freedmen were discouraged from loitering. Even the city's political heart, the Senate, was a space that defined power through exclusion. A Roman citizen might spend his entire life walking past its doors without ever seeing the inside. Far across the world in medieval Europe, cities grew into labyrinths of streets, guild halls, churches, and guarded buildings. Each guild had its own headquarters where craftsmen gathered behind closed doors. Apprentices were permitted entry, but outsiders were kept out to protect trade secrets. Churches too had their own layers, sanctuaries everyone could access, and inner chambers reserved only for priests. A normal villager might live and die without ever seeing the interior of these sacred rooms. Royal castles exaggerated these boundaries even further. Visitors might pass through outer courtyards, but were forbidden from entering residential wings without escort. Servants moved through back corridors invisible to nobles' kitchens, armories, and treasuries were sealed behind heavy doors. Each space reinforced a hierarchy, a world where authority expressed itself through architecture. In Imperial China, the Forbidden City became one of the most iconic expressions of restricted space. Behind its immense red walls lay a world within a world. Ornate halls, quiet courtyards, and entire families who rarely stepped beyond its gates. Only the emperor, his household, officials, and selected servants were allowed inside. Commoners could only imagine what lay behind the golden roofs. The gates were not just barriers of wood and bronze, they were symbols of cosmic order. To enter without permission was unthinkable. Throughout ancient India, sacred temples often contained inner sanctums where only specific priests or devotees could enter. These spaces were believed to house the presence of gods. Pilgrims traveled great distances to pray outside their thresholds, knowing they would never stand within the sanctum itself. The boundary was not oppressive, it was spiritual. The inner chamber's purity depended on its exclusivity. On distant islands across Polynesia, the concept of tapu, sacred restriction, marked certain locations as off-limits. These might be burial grounds, groves dedicated to deities, or stones believed to hold ancestral power. Violating tapu was more than social offense. It was believed to invite illness, disaster, or spiritual imbalance. Boundaries here were woven into the rhythm of life. In medieval Japan, entire districts became forbidden zones under the watch of the shogunate. During certain eras, the entertainment and pleasure quarters were walled off. Accessible only at specific gates, and under strict regulations, samurai were forbidden to enter without permission. Women working within these districts could seldom leave. These boundaries were both literal and symbolic, sharp separations between public life and hidden worlds. Africa, too, held sacred landscapes with strict rules. Among numerous cultures, royal compounds were heavily guarded, reserved for chiefs, kings, and spiritual leaders. Some villages had male-only or female-only ceremonial spaces. Others preserved forests, believed to be inhabited by ancestral spirits, where cutting trees or entering without ritual cleansing was forbidden. These natural sanctuaries often served ecological purposes as well, protecting biodiversity long before the concept had a modern name. Even early modern Europe embraced forbidden places shaped by fear rather than hierarchy. Plague hospitals were placed outside city walls, marked by ropes or painted signs. People avoided these areas instinctively, even after outbreaks ended abandoned buildings too. Old mills, ruined homes, collapsed monasteries developed their own myths. Children dared each other to approach them. Adults circled widely around them. Fear drew boundaries where no laws needed to exist, and in many indigenous cultures across North America, sacred mountains or canyons were protected by strict rules. Certain peaks were climbed only during ritual seasons. Caves used for ceremonies were never entered on ordinary days. Stories reminded communities that some landscapes were not meant for footsteps, only for reverence. Modern history brought its own forbidden places. In Soviet-era Russia, entire closed cities existed off the map, built for military or scientific projects. Outsiders were barred entirely. Residents were often unable to leave without special permission. Photographs were forbidden. These cities became modern echoes of ancient restrictions, spaces defined by secrecy. Even today, echoes linger. Government buildings, military bases, sacred shrines, private estates, and archaeological sites all maintain boundaries inherited from history. Some are meant to preserve safety. Others protect heritage. Many continue simply because tradition leaves strong footprints. Across cultures and centuries, forbidden places acted as mirrors of society. They revealed what communities valued: purity, power, knowledge, safety, or secrecy. They showed how societies organized themselves, deciding who belonged where and why. And they carved invisible maps inside cities and landscapes that shaped how people moved and lived. But no boundary is truly permanent. Walls crumble, rituals shift, gates open. What was once unreachable becomes ordinary. What was once feared becomes understood. The sacred becomes familiar. The hidden becomes seen. And so the history of forbidden places is not a story of exclusion alone. It is a story of how curiosity, courage, and time slowly pull down walls, revealing the world in all its layers. Music is one of humanity's oldest companions, a force that moves freely through emotion, memory, breath, and rhythm. But across history, even music was not always free. Some melodies were banned for being too powerful, too seductive, too revolutionary, or too sacred to be shared beyond narrow walls. Entire communities learned to silence certain tunes, avoid certain instruments, or abandon songs that once defined them. To begin, imagine the quiet of an ancient night broken by the soft plucking of strings. A melody drifts across a courtyard, delicate and haunting. But as the tune rises, a door slides shut, a lantern dims, and the musician stops abruptly, not because the melody faltered, but because the rules of the time forbade playing that particular song. Music, perhaps more than any other art, has long been shaped by what people were not allowed to hear. In ancient Greece, music was considered a moral force. Philosophers like Plato believed that certain modes, specific musical scales, had dangerous emotional effects. Melodies in the Phrygian mode were thought to incite passion and rebellion. Others were believed to weaken discipline or cloud judgment. As a result, entire musical styles were discouraged or banned in certain settings. Students learned only virtuous modes. Dancers avoided tunes that risked stirring excess emotion. Music became a tool of order. Centuries later, in medieval Europe, the Church's influence reached deep into all forms of artistic expression. Sacred music was carefully regulated, while secular songs were scrutinized for hints of immorality or superstition. Certain instruments were frowned upon: the drum for its association with dancing, the flute for its perceived sensuality, the fiddle for its popularity among traveling performers who defied social hierarchy. Some melodies were banned outright. Troubadours who sang songs of forbidden love risked punishment. Traveling minstrels who brought satirical songs into conservative towns were turned away, and folk tunes tied to pre-Christian rituals were silenced to prevent old beliefs from resurfacing. Music that once united communities became something whispered in secret. In Japan, the court music known as gagaku carried its own restrictions. Certain ceremonial pieces were reserved for imperial rituals and forbidden outside palace grounds. Their melodies were believed to hold spiritual significance linked to order and cosmic harmony. To perform them casually was to break a sacred rule. Meanwhile, in towns and villages, entertainers who used songs to mock authorities or nobles risked arrest. Music that poked at power was quickly silenced. In the Middle East, traditional chants held deep religious value. Some melodies were restricted to trained scholars or specific ritual moments. A sacred tune performed incorrectly was considered harmful, not spiritually dangerous in a mystical sense, but inappropriate, a distortion of something meant to be handled with reverence. To protect the integrity of the melody, only those who studied for years were allowed to perform it publicly. In West Africa, drumming traditions carried extraordinary symbolic weight. One rhythm could call a community together. Another could signal danger. Another could honor ancestors. These rhythms held such power that in certain historical periods, especially under colonial rule, drumming was banned or heavily restricted. Authorities feared that drums could communicate across long distances, carrying secret messages that fueled resistance. People hid drums, created makeshift instruments, or encoded rhythms into dance instead. Music became both forbidden and defiant. In medieval China, certain court pieces were reserved exclusively for imperial ceremonies. Some were tied to lunar cycles, seasonal rites, or ancestral offerings. Performing them without permission was considered deeply disrespectful. Musicians were trained for years to master the appropriate melodies, rhythms, and gestures, ensuring that the music never stepped outside the boundaries set by tradition. Europe in the Renaissance introduced a different kind of musical prohibition: censorship through morality. Dances considered too energetic, sensual, or chaotic were discouraged. Some cities restricted instruments that encouraged rowdy behavior. Others banned songs associated with political dissent. During the Protestant Reformation, entire musical traditions were attacked or suppressed. Polyphonic church music, complex, layered harmonies, was banned in some regions because critics claimed it distracted from devotion. Congregations were instructed to sing in plain, simple lines, removing ornamentation that might tempt the ear more than the spirit. And in various indigenous cultures of the Americas and Australia, the arrival of colonial powers brought devastating bans on traditional songs. Melodies tied to creation stories, healing rituals, or ancestral histories were outlawed. Instruments were confiscated. Ceremonial gatherings were broken apart. The forbidden music was not merely silenced, it was nearly erased. But even in silence, music endured. Songs were hummed quietly, passed secretly from elder to child, preserved in memory when instruments were taken away. A tune whispered is still a tune living. And when the bans finally lifted, melodies re-emerged, carrying with them the weight of worlds nearly lost. In the 20th century, censorship took new forms. Totalitarian governments banned songs that criticized authority. Jazz was condemned in some countries as degenerate. Folk music tied to resistance movements was smothered under laws designed to suppress unity. Radio stations were ordered to avoid certain lyrics. Even rhythms deemed too foreign or modern were forbidden. And yet, as always, forbidden music traveled anyway, through underground recordings, coded performances, or gatherings held behind closed doors. What was silenced in one room found voice in another. Today, music moves freely across borders. Songs that were once reserved for kings can be streamed in seconds. Melodies once banned for rebellion are celebrated as cultural treasures. Chants that were nearly lost have returned to festivals, ceremonies, and classrooms. Yet the echoes of those restrictions linger. They remind us that music is more than entertainment. It is memory. It is identity. It is emotion shaped into sound. And across history, societies have feared it for the same reason they have cherished it, because a melody, once released into the air, cannot easily be controlled. Music finds ways to survive, even when it is forbidden, even when it is silenced, even when only one person remembers the tune. It waits, and when the world is ready again, it returns, softly at first, then rising, filling the space where silence once lived. Entertainment, whether dance, theatre, games, or simple celebration, has always been a reflection of the human spirit. It releases tension, builds unity, and reminds people of joy. But throughout history, joy itself has been seen as dangerous. In many societies, forms of entertainment were forbidden for being too wild, too corrupting, too independent, too distracting, or simply too difficult for authorities to control. To step into this world, imagine a village square in the late afternoon, filled with light and laughter. Children chase each other between market stalls, musicians pluck rhythmic melodies. A dancer spins, kicking dust into the air, and suddenly stops, glancing at the approaching official. The music grows quiet. The dancers step back. The rule has been broken, and the celebration must end. Fun, for reasons shaped by generations, is not always allowed. Let us wander through the forbidden festivities of history. In medieval Europe, dancing was both beloved and feared. Villagers danced to celebrate harvests, weddings, and festivals marking the turning of the seasons. But church leaders worried about these gatherings. Dancing brought people close together, too close, some believed. Bodies swayed, hands touched, hearts raced, and rules softened. Priests warned that such movements encouraged temptation, and so in many towns, dancing in public squares was banned after certain hours, restricted during Lent, or forbidden entirely during specific years. Even stranger were the bans during outbreaks of the so-called dancing mania, when groups of people danced uncontrollably for hours or days. Authorities, unsure whether this was spiritual possession, illness, or rebellion, forbade music altogether. If no melody played, officials reasoned, no madness could spread. Silence became the cure. Theatre faced similar restrictions. In ancient Athens, the birthplace of drama, theatre was revered. But centuries later in medieval Europe, theatre was seen as a threat. Religious leaders feared that actors mocking authority or portraying devils might distract people from piety. Entire phases of history saw theatres shuttered, actors scorned, and scripts confiscated. Plots deemed too political or too irreverent were forbidden. The most dramatic example came in the 17th century England, when the Puritan government banned theatre entirely. Playhouses closed, stages decayed, Actors were arrested if caught performing. Street performers found themselves chased from markets. For years, joy in the form of drama existed only in secret gatherings where scripts were whispered and laughter was stifled. But entertainment is persistent. Even under severe restriction, wandering actors performed in barns, woods, or private homes. Theatre survived not because it was permitted, but because humans cannot live without stories. In China's long imperial history, entertainment was also carefully regulated. Certain types of folk performance, comedic skits, satirical songs, or exaggerated dances were banned within city walls for fear they would encourage disorder or mock local officials. Opera troupes traveling between towns needed permits. Puppet shows were restricted in some regions because they were believed to spread superstitions. Even shadow plays, with their flickering figures and dramatic movements, were banned in periods of strict governance. In Japan, entire entertainment districts were walled off, turning pleasure itself into a controlled space. People could enter only through guarded gates. Performers, courtesans, musicians, and actors lived tightly regulated lives. And although these districts were famous for their artistry and celebration, leaving them freely was not always permitted. Fun was allowed only where it could be contained. In many Islamic societies during specific historical periods, music, dancing, and certain styles of storytelling were restricted. Scholars sometimes debated the morality of musical entertainment. Certain instruments were discouraged. Dancing could be banned in public spaces if authorities believed it encouraged impropriety or disorder. And storytellers whose tales included satire or political commentary were sometimes silenced. Entertainment had to be uplifting, respectful, or spiritual, not frivolous. In the Americas, indigenous ceremonies, dances, songs, and festivals that carried centuries of tradition were banned or heavily restricted by colonial powers. Authorities feared that gatherings could spark unity or resistance. Drums were outlawed in some regions. Ceremonial dances were prohibited. Festivals that honored ancestors or natural cycles were suppressed. What had once been cultural pillars became dangerous acts simply because they expressed identity. Many tribes preserved their traditions in secret. Dances survived in remote forests. Stories passed quietly from elder to child. A forbidden celebration is still a celebration, whispered, hidden, but alive. Even sports have been banned. In medieval England, football, a chaotic physical ancestor of modern soccer, was banned repeatedly because it caused injuries, damaged property, and distracted men from archery practice, which the Crown deemed essential for national defense. Games, in the eyes of rulers, were not harmless recreation. They were distractions that threatened authority. In early modern Scotland, golf was banned for similar reasons. Young men practiced too much golf and not enough archery. The king declared the sport an enemy of national skill. Even leisure at times was seen as rebellion. In Victorian Europe and America, card games and dances like the waltz were seen as morally questionable. The waltz was scandalous because couples danced too closely. Critics argued it encouraged desire. Some towns banned it outright, while others allowed it only under strict supervision. Card games were associated with gambling and sin. Entire regions forbade them in public houses. Even harmless parlor games received suspicious glances if they seemed too exciting. Some of the strangest bans of all came from fear rather than morality. In parts of medieval Europe, festivals involving masks or disguises were banned because authorities feared criminals might use costumes to commit mischief. Bonfires during certain seasons were restricted because sparks could cause citywide disasters. Carnivals were sometimes cancelled during periods of plague or famine, not because people disapproved of merriment, but because joy felt dangerous in desperate times. But like music, entertainment always survived. When dancing was forbidden in squares, people danced in homes. When theatre was banned, actors performed in barns. When festivals were outlawed, communities created secret ones at night, beneath trees or in hidden courtyards. And when entire traditions were attacked, people held on to them fiercely, preserving them until the world softened enough to welcome celebration again. Today, many of the entertainments once considered dangerous are beloved parts of global culture. Dances once banned are performed at weddings. Theatres once shuttered are now historic treasures. Festivals once restricted now draw thousands. And games once discouraged have become sports watched by millions. But the memory of those bans remains. It reminds us that joy is powerful. Powerful enough to shake empires, unsettle rulers, inspire unity, or simply remind people of their own humanity. Entertainment, at its core, has always been more than fun. It has been expression, resistance, identity, connection. And that is precisely why, across so many eras, so many tried to forbid it. Work is one of the most defining parts of human life, shaping identity, status, purpose, and survival. Yet across history, entire professions were not simply discouraged, but forbidden. Some jobs were outlawed because they were considered dangerous or unclean. Others were kept exclusive to certain castes, families, or classes. And many were banned because the skills they required held a kind of power that rulers did not want ordinary people to possess. To explore these forbidden professions is to understand the invisible walls that shaped societies long before modern career paths existed. Begin in ancient India, where the caste system divided society into distinct layers, each bound by tradition. Certain professions were restricted to specific castes, and stepping outside one's assigned role was not just difficult, it was socially and spiritually forbidden. Priests, warriors, merchants, and laborers each held roles passed from parent to child. But there were also people assigned to occupations others refused to touch: butchers, tanners, corpse handlers. These jobs were seen as ritually impure. Those who performed them were essential to society, yet kept at the edge of it, restricted not only by custom, but by unwritten law. A child born to a tanner was expected to stay a tanner for life, no matter their talent or ambition. In feudal Japan, a similar divide existed. Farmers, artisans, warriors, and traders each occupied rigid positions. But beneath them were outcast groups forced into professions considered unclean: leatherworkers, executioners, undertakers, and those who handled animal carcasses. These roles were crucial but stigmatized. People in these professions lived in separate districts, faced legal limitations, and were forbidden to hold other jobs. Even if an individual possessed extraordinary skill, the boundaries of their birth prevented them from entering professions reserved for higher social groups. Work in this context was not a choice, it was destiny. Across medieval Europe, guild systems created their own form of restriction. Guilds controlled trades such as baking, carpentry, tanning, metalworking, and weaving. To work in any of these professions, one needed membership. Becoming a member required approval, fees, training, and sometimes family lineage. Outsiders were barred from practicing the craft. A talented blacksmith who lacked guild backing could be fined or imprisoned. A baker who tried to sell bread without guild authorization risked having their goods seized. The guilds protected quality, but they also protected monopoly. Professions were locked behind gates few could enter. Some professions were banned altogether for ordinary people because they were seen as too politically dangerous. In ancient Rome, astrologers and diviners faced restrictions depending on the emperor's whims. Astrology was immensely popular, and rulers feared predictions that might inspire rebellion or undermine authority. Skilled astrologers were summoned by emperors in private, yet forbidden from practicing openly for the masses. Those caught defying these rules could face exile or execution. Knowledge of the stars, it seemed, was too potent to be left unregulated. In the Islamic world, during certain historical periods, alchemy, the pursuit of transforming metals or discovering immortality, was both revered and forbidden. Some rulers encouraged scholars to explore it under controlled environments, while others outlawed it entirely, fearing fraud, false promises, or the destabilizing possibilities of success. An unlicensed alchemist risked imprisonment, torture, or worse. The profession walked a razor's edge between brilliant science and dangerous ambition. In medieval Europe, midwifery was a profession simultaneously needed and forbidden. Midwives held knowledge of childbirth, herbs, and remedies passed through generations, but in times of religious tension, their skills were viewed with suspicion. Women who assisted in childbirth without official approval were accused of practicing witchcraft. Some were prosecuted simply for being too effective at healing or relieving pain. The profession that brought life into the world became one that could endanger the life of the practitioner. Meanwhile, executioners across Europe faced a different kind of restriction. Their job was a legal necessity, yet deeply stigmatized. Executioners and their families often lived on the outskirts of towns. They were forbidden from attending certain public gatherings, joining guilds, or marrying outside their profession. Children of executioners were sometimes expected to inherit the role whether they wished to or not. Society needed their work, but did not want to see them outside that dark context. In China, during certain dynasties, performers, actors, dancers, and musicians were placed near the bottom of the social hierarchy. Entertainers were often legally prohibited from holding government positions or marrying into respectable families. Their profession was considered morally questionable, no matter how skilled they were. Some spent their entire lives performing for nobles while being forbidden from taking part in the very society they entertained. In early modern Europe, professions connected to printing and book production faced similar restrictions. Printers needed licenses, sometimes renewed every year, to prove they were not producing forbidden texts. Without approval, printing presses could be confiscated and workers imprisoned. The ability to reproduce words on paper was a power that governments watched closely. Later, during colonial periods across the world, entire groups were forbidden from holding certain professions so that colonial authorities could maintain control. Skilled crafts, leadership roles, trading rights, and religious positions were restricted to the ruling class or to approved intermediaries. Local artisans, healers, or merchants were often pushed aside or forced into low-status labor. The forbidden profession was not always one job. It was entire categories of influence. Even in the modern age, professions were restricted based on gender. In Victorian England, women were prohibited from becoming lawyers, doctors, scholars, or politicians. Universities barred female students from entering lecture halls. Law courts rejected women not because they lacked capability, but because society believed authority belonged only to men. Women who attempted to break these barriers faced ridicule, ostracism, or legal obstacles designed to keep them in their place. A forbidden profession could be as simple as ambition that did not fit the mold. Across civilizations, forbidden professions reveal more than rules. They reveal fears: fear of social disorder, fear of impurity, fear of knowledge, fear of change, and fear of those whose skills could challenge the structure of power. Yet time softened these boundaries. Guilds weakened, castes loosened, women entered universities, Astrologers became entertainers rather than threats. Performers rose to global fame. Traditional crafts once restricted became celebrated cultural treasures. Jobs once forbidden became career paths. But behind every modern freedom is the shadow of what was once forbidden. Reminders that work, like identity, has always been tied to power, and that throughout history, not everyone had the chance to choose their own path. Tools and inventions often reshape the world long before societies understand what they truly mean. A metal blade changes farming. A wheel changes travel. A lens changes how we see the heavens. But throughout history, many inventions arrived with fear, suspicion, or political anxiety trailing behind them. Some were banned because they threatened existing forms of power, others because they empowered ordinary people too quickly, and some were outlawed simply because they were misunderstood. To explore these forbidden tools, imagine a quiet workshop in the past, a dim room lit by a single oil lamp. A craftsman polishes a new tool, its shape unfamiliar, its potential enormous. But before the tool ever reaches the marketplace, a message arrives. The creation is banned, too dangerous, too disruptive, too strange. A forbidden invention is often a mirror reflecting what society is afraid to face. Begin in ancient China with one of the most influential inventions in human history. The crossbow, a device of extraordinary force and accuracy. It required far less training than the traditional bow. A master archer needed years of disciplined practice. A crossbowman needed weeks. This democratization of power unsettled rulers. If common soldiers could wield weapons powerful enough to pierce armor, then noble warriors lost their advantage. During certain dynasties, crossbows were tightly restricted or banned from private use. Craftsmen were monitored, workshops recorded every part they produced. A technology wasn't always forbidden because it caused harm. Sometimes it was forbidden because it changed the balance of who held strength. Ancient Greece also wrestled with the implications of invention. When Archimedes designed war machines capable of flinging stones with terrifying precision, later generations viewed his devices with awe and suspicion. Some insisted these creations bordered on magic. Others believed such machines should never again be replicated. Innovation sometimes frightened even those who admired it. In medieval Europe, the printing press sparked one of the most dramatic waves of technological censorship. Books had previously been copied by hand, slowly and expensively, accessible only to elites. When the press suddenly allowed ideas to spread at unprecedented speed, authorities panicked. Certain rulers required printing licenses. Others demanded that every book pass through a censor. Unauthorized presses were seized. Printers could be jailed. The very act of reproducing words became revolutionary. The printing press was dangerous, not because it printed rebellions, but because it made knowledge easier to obtain than anyone believed safe. Even simpler inventions faced bans. In medieval England, the private hand mill, small, portable, and efficient, was prohibited in many regions. Lords wanted peasants to rely on the official manor mill, which charged fees. A hand mill threatened that economic control. Authorities confiscated them, destroyed them, or fined anyone caught grinding grain in secret. A forbidden object was not always a weapon. Sometimes it was a tool that made life a little too free. Elsewhere, navigation technology stirred suspicion. Early compasses were regarded by some European authorities as instruments of sorcery. A needle that pointed north without explanation felt unnatural, hinting at forces beyond human control. Sailors hid compasses beneath cloaks, and captains used them discreetly to avoid accusations of witchcraft. A device we now take for granted once carried an aura of danger. Then came the telescope, a window into the universe. When Galileo used it to observe moons orbiting Jupiter, the discovery challenged firmly held beliefs about Earth's place in the cosmos. The idea that humanity was not at the center of creation felt threatening to authorities invested in older worldviews. Galileo's writings were banned, his observations were condemned. The telescope, an object of pure insight, was treated as if it were a weapon against order. Microscopes met similar skepticism. Some scholars argued that magnifying the unseen overstepped spiritual boundaries. Others worried that discovering tiny creatures would disrupt social certainty. A world full of invisible organisms was frightening to societies unprepared to face it. A tool that revealed too much could be just as forbidden as a tool that harmed. In Japan's Edo period, the arrival of Western technology triggered strict regulation. Firearms, initially adopted with enthusiasm, were later restricted to preserve the hierarchy of samurai warriors. Books on foreign science were screened or banned. Clocks, maps, and mechanical toys sometimes faced restrictions because they symbolized outside influence. Innovation was allowed only in controlled doses. In the Ottoman Empire, the printing press encountered centuries of resistance. Authorities feared that mass-produced books could spread errors in religious texts or disrupt established scholarship. For a long time, printing Arabic script was prohibited. Knowledge remained chained to handwritten manuscripts while printing reshaped the rest of the world. A forbidden tool could stall progress for an entire civilization. During the Industrial Revolution, new machines threatened traditional crafts. Workers destroyed mechanical looms and knitting frames. Governments responded by banning certain devices temporarily. Hoping to calm unrest, innovation had to come slowly or risk destabilizing entire regions. Colonial powers also restricted tools in the territories they controlled. Metalworking instruments, weapons, printing equipment, and even musical instruments were banned in some regions to prevent rebellion or cultural unity. A tool in the wrong hands was not merely an object, it was a spark. Even in the 20th century, radio transmitters, cameras, encryption devices, and early computers faced legal restrictions. The fear was always the same. Too much capability in the hands of the public meant less control for those in charge. Yet across history, forbidden inventions did not vanish. They survived in hidden workshops, in secret schools, in quiet acts of curiosity. Some were smuggled, some rediscovered, some reinvented. And when restrictions eventually eased, these tools stepped into the world fully formed, shaping eras that once tried to silence them. A banned invention is never just an object. It is a moment of hesitation, a society caught between fear and possibility, uncertainty and progress. And once that hesitation passes, the world moves forward forever changed. Truth is powerful. It challenges authority, shifts belief, and unsettles the comfortable. It can inspire hope or ignite rebellion. And because of this power, many societies chose not to confront truth at all. Instead, they forbade it. Certain ideas were declared too dangerous to voice, certain topics too divisive to explore, certain realities too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Entire worlds of knowledge were pushed into silence, not because they lacked importance, but because they carried too much of it. To understand these forbidden truths, imagine a candle-lit room in a distant past. Scholars whisper scrolls are unrolled in secret, and a scribe leans over parchment, glancing toward the door with every line he writes. Not all knowledge is welcome here. Some of it must be hidden in drawers, spoken only after dark. Begin in ancient empires where rulers claimed divine origin. Questioning a king's lineage, authority, or decisions was not merely impolite. It was treason in Egypt. To openly doubt the pharaoh's connection to the gods risked punishment. In Mesopotamia, criticizing a king's justice could lead to exile in China. Questioning the legitimacy of a dynasty challenged the mandate of heaven, an offense that could cost a life. Truth about leadership, when inconvenient, was forbidden. The same could be said of military failures. Victories were celebrated, carved into stone, sung by poets. Defeats were concealed, erased, or retold as partial successes. In some civilizations, speaking publicly of lost battles was discouraged or outlawed. The purpose was not deception, but stability. Admitting weakness threatened order, morale, and loyalty. And so truth was trimmed and reshaped. Religion, too, created forbidden truths. Throughout medieval Europe, theological disagreements were not intellectual debates. They were dangerous deviations. Ideas that challenged official doctrine were labeled heresy books, containing alternative interpretations were burned. Scholars who questioned sacred texts were imprisoned or executed. Forbidden truths here were not falsehoods. They were simply too disruptive to tolerate. In the Islamic world, through certain historical periods, discussing controversial philosophical ideas without the right credentials was restricted. Mystical writings, unorthodox interpretations, or challenges to tradition had to be handled carefully. Knowledge could illuminate, but it could also provoke authorities guarded religious truth not to smother discovery, but to protect cohesion. Ancient Greece, often celebrated as a cradle of philosophy, also had its forbidden ideas. Socrates was executed not for a crime of violence, but for encouraging people to question everything: gods, traditions, authority. His pursuit of truth threatened those who depended on unquestioned belief. Even in a society that valued debate, the wrong truth spoken at the wrong time was fatal. Forbidden knowledge took many other forms. Astronomy, for example. Long before telescopes revealed the true nature of the universe, thinkers who proposed that Earth might not be the center of everything risked ridicule or punishment. Their observations challenged cosmic hierarchy, and by extension, earthly hierarchy. When Galileo defended heliocentrism, his works were banned, not because the science was weak, but because the truth carried implications that unsettled the established order. Medicine, too, had its forbidden truths. In Europe, dissection of human bodies was banned for centuries. Understanding anatomy required violating taboos about the sacredness of the dead. Without dissection, knowledge stagnated. But when it began secretly, then openly, forbidden truths emerged, truths that saved lives. Even geography was censored. Some ancient rulers discouraged maps showing distant lands or alternate trade routes. Knowledge of the world's size, resources, or neighboring cultures was power, and power in the wrong hands created vulnerability. In early modern Europe, colonial powers hid the brutality of conquest. Official reports praised missions of civilization while burying accounts of exploitation. To speak openly of cruelty was to threaten the machinery of empire. Forbidden truths were the ones that exposed injustice. In 19th century America and Europe, discussing certain topics like mental illness, sexuality, or the inequalities of industrial labor was taboo. These truths were not banned by law, but smothered by cultural pressure. Newspapers avoided them, families hid them, doctors whispered about them. A forbidden truth is sometimes enforced not by rulers, but by society itself. In many indigenous cultures, some truths were restricted for different reasons to protect sacred knowledge. Stories about creation, healing rituals, or ancestral power were not shared with outsiders. They were not forbidden in the oppressive sense, but held in careful guardianship. Truth, in this context, was sacred rather than dangerous. Modern history offers its own examples. During the 20th century, authoritarian regimes banned discussions of political dissent, economic failures, corruption, or historical atrocities. Citizens learned to speak in code. Families whispered behind closed doors. Whole generations grew up knowing that certain truths existed, yet could not be spoken. But forbidden truths have a way of resurfacing. They survive in memory, in secret writings, in quiet conversations whispered in kitchens or taught in classrooms after hours. When censorship finally weakens, these truths emerge with remarkable force. They reshape narratives. They correct history. They restore dignity to voices long silenced. Truth cannot be permanently buried. It can be pushed aside, rewritten, or hidden, but it persists. It waits for cracks in the walls built around it. And when the moment comes, it returns, often stronger than before. To explore forbidden truths is to explore the boundary between power and curiosity. It reveals what societies feared, what they protected, and what they attempted to control. But more importantly, it reveals that truth, even when forbidden, is resilient. It survives through silence, then rises through time. Rules once created have a way of feeling permanent. When a society declares something forbidden, a color, a word, a food, a tool, a gesture, it can seem as though the rule will last forever. But history teaches a different lesson. Nearly every prohibition, no matter how rigid or sacred, eventually loosens. Some dissolve quietly, others collapse in a single dramatic moment. Many fade slowly, like lantern light thinning at dawn. To understand how these bans disappeared, imagine standing at the crossroads of centuries. Around you lie the remnants of countless rules, threads snipped from forbidden garments, tools once hidden, words once whispered, songs once banned. What happened to them? How did the world drift out of their grasp? The answer lies in an ongoing dance between necessity, courage, curiosity, and time itself. For many bans, the first cracks appeared through practical need. When survival demanded change, old rules could not hold. In ancient societies where certain foods were taboo, famine sometimes forced people to eat what was previously forbidden. A vegetable feared by one generation became sustenance for the next. Stories softened, memories shifted, and what had once seemed dangerous became normal. Tomatoes, potatoes, coffee, and chocolate all followed this arc, from suspicion to acceptance to everyday comfort. Economic change weakened other prohibitions. When dyes became cheaper, color restrictions lost meaning. When trade routes expanded, rare materials became common. When new markets emerged, old monopolies collapsed. A guild's exclusive right to make certain tools meant little once factories began producing them at scale. A royal ban on luxurious fabric held no weight when merchant ships imported bolts by the thousands. The world grew wider, and the walls around forbidden objects grew small. Curiosity also played its part. People asked questions that could not easily be silenced. Why can't we wear this color? Why is this tool off limits? Why is this melody dangerous? Why can't this profession be open to everyone? Every question nudged at the edges of a prohibition, loosening the threads. When enough questions were asked, rules that once felt immovable became harder to justify. Education, too, pushed boundaries outward. As literacy spread, banned ideas leaked into public awareness. Copies of censored books circulated secretly. Scholars taught forbidden concepts to students who carried them forward. A single book smuggled across a border could undo years of restriction. Knowledge was a quiet and persistent solvent, dissolving the glue that held old rules together. Trade and travel accelerated the process. A traveler might return from a distant land wearing a color forbidden at home. A sailor might bring a story of a place where certain words were freely spoken. A merchant might introduce a tool or flavor unknown to their own culture. Exposure reshapes belief. Once people discovered that others lived differently and safely, the certainty of old prohibitions wavered. Social mobility also weakened boundaries. A growing middle class demanded freedoms once reserved for elites. Merchants wore bright clothing. Craftsmen bought books. Women entered professions once barred to them. Commoners tasted foods once reserved for nobles. As people crossed the borders of old hierarchies, the rules defining those borders faded. The more society shifted, the less sense the prohibitions made. Some bans fell because of quiet resistance. A tailor stitched hidden colors beneath a coat's lining. A musician played a forbidden melody behind closed doors. A scholar saved a banned manuscript beneath floorboards. A dancer practiced steps restricted by local custom. Small acts of defiance accumulated, like water dripping on stone. Over time, the stone gave way. Other prohibitions collapsed dramatically through political change. Revolutions swept away caste rules, clothing laws, and controls on expression. New governments overturned decrees that had lasted centuries. A single proclamation could grant people access to colors, professions, or ideas previously locked behind social walls. The Enlightenment brought a wave of change across Europe. Reason, curiosity, and individual rights challenged religious and political restrictions. Scientists pursued forbidden truths. Artists explored banned themes. Philosophers argued that knowledge should be free. As a new worldview emerged, prohibitions rooted in fear or symbolic control lost their foundation. Industrialization created yet another shift. Machines made scarcity less common. Mass production democratized access to goods once reserved for elites. Clothing laws became laughably outdated in a world where fabrics could be woven in hours rather than months. Tools that once unsettled rulers became everyday household objects. Colonial empires fell, and with them many imposed bans. Cultures reclaimed forbidden songs, dances, and rituals. Crafts once suppressed returned stronger than before, carried proudly by the communities they belonged to. What had been hidden became celebrated. Modern political movements dismantled restrictions based on gender, race, and class. Professions once closed became accessible. Words once taboo became normalized. Truths once forbidden were taught openly. The public challenged institutions that attempted to maintain old systems of silence. Technology accelerated the collapse of the final walls. The internet broke the monopoly of gatekeepers. Information spread instantly, ignoring borders and censorship. Once an idea exists online, it becomes nearly impossible to erase. Forbidden truths became accessible to anyone with a screen. But perhaps the most important force behind the disappearance of bans was something simple and deeply human: empathy. As societies learned more about each other, through communication, through travel, through shared stories, they grew less fearful of difference. The unknown became familiar. The forbidden became ordinary. Rules rooted in anxiety dissolved when confronted with understanding. The more connected people became, the less they needed prohibitions to feel secure. Today, most of the bans that shaped early civilizations have disappeared. But traces remain, in old phrases, in inherited habits, in ceremonies, in stories. And while modern societies still impose restrictions of their own, the long arc of history shows that bans weaken as the world opens. What begins as forbidden often ends as familiar. What once carried danger becomes tradition, routine, or even joy. And the world continues to widen, making space for freedoms once unimaginable. Across this journey through the strangest bands in history, forbidden colors, forbidden foods, forbidden words, forbidden places, forbidden tools, a pattern emerges. Despite the walls societies built, despite the rules carved into stone or whispered through generations, human beings never stopped reaching beyond the boundaries placed around them. Curiosity, that quiet ember glowing beneath all cultures, refused to go out. Imagine the world centuries ago, dimly lit by lanterns, shaped by fear as much as by belief. A young tailor stitches a forbidden color into a hidden lining. A midwife practices her craft despite the threat of punishment. A printer operates a press in the back of a shop after dark. A musician holds onto a melody taught to them in secret. A scholar copies a banned manuscript onto fragile paper, knowing it may never be read in their lifetime. These are acts of courage, small, persistent, and transformative. They reveal a truth older than any law. Human beings cannot help but explore. We question, we test, we imagine what lies beyond the edge of the known. Even the strictest prohibitions cannot permanently silence the human desire to understand the world. When a color is forbidden, someone mixes pigments to replicate it. When a profession is closed, someone pursues the skill anyway. When a story is banned, someone retells it in whispers. When a truth is hidden, someone preserves it for the future. History is full of these quiet rebellions. Some were tiny acts, hardly noticeable to those in power. A merchant wearing a shade of red a little too bright. A villager humming a song that had been outlawed. A sailor using a compass discreetly at sea. A child asking why their family follows a rule that makes no sense anymore. Others were bold acts that changed entire eras. The spread of books despite censorship. The rediscovery of forgotten knowledge, the scientific breakthroughs that challenged sacred assumptions. For every rule intended to confine, there were people ready to push against the edges, widening them bit by bit. Slowly, gently, sometimes painfully, the world learned to let go. Clothing laws faded as fabrics became common. Tools once feared became essential. Songs once banned became cultural treasures. Professions once forbidden opened to all. Ideas once dangerous became chapters in history books. Truths once whispered became truths taught openly. This evolution did not happen all at once. It unfolded across centuries, through debate, struggle, discovery, and the simple, persistent curiosity of ordinary people. And yet, even today, echoes of the old restrictions linger, not as rules carved in law books, but as habits of thought. Certain topics still feel uncomfortable. Certain ideas still spark defensiveness. Certain innovations still arrive with suspicion. Certain identities still face boundaries. But the arc continues to bend. Curiosity remains. And the human desire to question, to understand, to taste, to see, to explore, to express, that desire endures. Think of how far the world has come. Colors once reserved for kings now brighten the clothing of children. Foods once feared are everyday staples. Professions once sealed behind rigid birthrights are open to talent and ambition. Tools once banned now sit quietly in pockets and homes. Truths once dangerous are accessible with a single tap on a screen. The story of forbidden things is not only about restriction, it is about resilience, imagination, and the slow but unstoppable expansion of freedom. As the lantern of this episode dims, picture all the voices, hands, and minds that nudged the world forward, not through force but through persistence. They remind us that progress rarely comes in grand, sweeping gestures. More often, it comes through small acts of curiosity, repeated by countless people until the world changes around them. And so, traveler, As our journey ends, consider this. Every age has its boundaries, every society has its unspoken rules, and every generation has its quiet rebels, the ones who ask why, the ones who dream differently, the ones who look beyond what is forbidden. They are the reason the world keeps opening. They are the reason we know more today than those before us. They are the reason so many once forbidden things now feel ordinary, even beautiful. Curiosity survives. It persists through silence, through caution, through fear. It waits, patient and luminous, like a lantern carried from one era to the next. And as long as that lantern remains lit, there will always be someone willing to step beyond the boundary and discover what lies just beyond the edge of what was once forbidden.